Hello, my name is Brad Kramer with Provanio Consulting, and today I want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about hazard recognition. When we think about the safety trainings that we've had over the years, a lot of times those safety trainings go into how we do things, like how to put on a harness, how to fill out a hot work permit, and stuff like that. And they don't get a whole lot into the hazard recognition. For example, when we talk about chemical safety, I think I've only been in one class that's really talked about vapor pressure as one of the hazards with chemicals. And that was a 3 day, specifically hazmat response course. So, of course, that was more in depth. As an employee, before I became an instructor, I never really got taught vapor pressure. So, that's just one example out of many hazards that we think of when we're talking about different safety topics. So, that one specifically involving chemical safety. But a lot of hazard recognition techniques that we as safety professionals use when we're looking at a job site, how to work safely and stuff like that, never really get taught to the workers that are in the classroom. That's one thing that I really focus on as an instructor is hazard recognition. I think that's actually more important than focusing on any regulations, company policy and stuff like that, because when you can recognize the hazards that you're working with, rather than just following a set of rules, then it becomes much easier to work safely. Now you're cognizant of it. You don't bypass that hazard anymore because you don't recognize it. So you're going to be more likely to recognize the hazard and then take the precautions necessary rather than remembering what's in all the company policies or OSHA regulations. So getting back to hazard recognition, pretty much everything that we deal with in safety, it has hazards. That's why it's a safety concern, right? Why it has risk. A lot of employees don't get that hazard recognition training. So that safety training, it basically year over year, it just becomes the same repetitive training one year after the next. This is our policy, this is what OSHA says, and this is what we expect you as employees to do, rather than taking that training to a whole new level and actually you're engaging your workers as participants in a classroom who are there to learn. So I get a very different response than from a lot of other instructors who still focus on company policy and what OSHA says versus when I teach hazard recognition, employees usually walk out of the same type of training, like the same topic that they've had for the last 15 years. And they tell me that this is the first time they've really learned something new because I got to the root of what is that hazard? How do you recognize it? So, for example, like I was just talking about vapor pressure here, if we look at a safety data sheet, so I'm going to pull up my screen here that has a safety data sheet. And if we're looking at the safety data sheet, right, if we're scrolling through it, anybody can read the safety data sheet, right? Anybody can look at it and say it says gasoline, all grades, right? And pretty much every employee is usually going to know where to find these, right? Sometimes there'll be it hasn't been trained on or something like that where employees may not know. But for most of the time, when I'm coming into a company doing a training, I say, "Hey, where's your SDSs?" Most classes, all the hands go up in the room that people know where to find them. Anybody can read this sheet, so gasoline, all grades, so forth. That's what it says. We can read it, but can we understand it? So, for example, if we were to look at this gasoline safety data sheet and go down to properties, so we're going to go down to section 9. In almost every case, I've rarely walked into a classroom where I had a safety data sheet like this and I said, "Can you tell me what this means? Interpret it for me. What does it mean to you as making decisions?" Very rarely do I have a participant who understands what this means, unless I've taught them the previous year to actually understand what these hazards are. So when we look at this, for example, what are these chemical characteristics mean for gasoline? Boiling range, 85 to 437 degrees. Vapor pressure, 275 to 475 millimeters of mercury. What does that mean, right? A lot of times employees have trouble interpreting that. So when we focus on what is vapor pressure and tell them what it means, that it's going to evaporate rather quickly, we kind of all instinctively know that gasoline evaporates. It fills up a space real quickly with that smell, especially if it's warm. But those workers can't tell you why, right? And vapor pressure is exactly why. So we focus on vapor pressure. What does it mean? So if gasoline or any other chemical that has a higher vapor pressure, if it has that number, it's going to come and get you. As soon as I walk into that room, I can be 20 feet away from a spill, but if I flip a light switch, if it's gasoline or something that's flammable, kaboom, the room could explode because vapor pressure allowed that thing to evaporate and fill that space with its hazards. In this case, gasoline being explosive, but many other chemicals that have corrosive properties, flammable, they might be toxic, they might displace oxygen. So by understanding what vapor pressure is, they can understand how those hazards are going to impact them. So I don't want to get too hung up on vapor pressure. That's just a good example of one hazard that very, very, very few employees actually understand. So when we talk about HAZCOM, for example, hazard communication, usually when OSHA walks in and does an inspection of almost any company that's going to have chemicals, whether they use chemicals in their processes, whether they're, say, sanitation or food companies that use chemicals for sanitation, anything like that, they usually have chemicals. And one of the first questions OSHA is usually going to ask is, can we see your HAZCOM program? And a lot of times they're looking at it, they'll look through the policies and see you have a policy, and then they look at training, they recognize that employees are missing training. Because usually a lot of times employees haven't been through, they might not have been to that training date. Like you have an employee that they were sick that day and stuff like that. So they're looking for gaps in the training. And then they look at the training content. Do they actually understand the safety data sheets? And a lot of times they'll actually go out and ask employees on the plant floor, hey, do you know where to find your safety data sheet? So if employees haven't been well trained, that might be a big red flag during that inspection process for you. The other thing is when employees don't understand those hazards out on the plant floor, that's where they're going to make mistakes, right? They don't know, they're fallible. They haven't had that good training to recognize those hazards. So when we look at any type of hazard or any type of safety program, we should be training employees how to recognize those hazards and what it means to them. I don't care if we're talking chemical hazards, fall protection, or working from height hazards, confined space hazards. When employees understand the hazards, that's when they can make the right decisions to keep themselves safe. So I strongly recommend you look at your training programs. What do you have within your company? How do you train employees? Do you just train them to do a job, to do a task, or do you get to the root of the why? Why do we do it this way? How does this hazard impact them? What does it look like? Now they're going to recognize that hazard, and I can pretty much guarantee you're going to see a lot less accidents because employees will recognize what that hazard is rather than just following some policy that they've probably never looked at and read. So let's get back to the basics of safety training and bring hazard recognition back to the forefront of your safety training program. Brad Kramer from Provanio Consulting, have a great day and watch out for those hazards.